the RUSI of New South Wales, we have endeavoured to deliver our lunchtime lectures online while our presentation venue, the Anzac Memorial Sydney, has been closed and other COVID-19 restrictions have applied. This has not been easy. Our presenters are busy people. Finding the time to talk to a computer has not always been possible. Our thanks to Professor Admiral Chris Barrie, AC retired, for providing us with this quality presentation.
Hello there. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to come back to address you after about 4 years on the topic of climate change as an important component of our national security. I had expected to be there today in person to be able to do this, but as I'm sure most of you are aware, the current pandemic measures means that we're, most of us, locked away, being careful, exercising security precautions, and waiting to see what happens next. It's a bit of a pity, because I do like to do these things person to person, but it means you've got to put up with me by video, and I will not be able to take your questions and answers at the end of this session. But when we do get to the end, even though I can only hit some key points, I hope you'll join with me in picking up the cudgels and discussing issues of climate change as a component of national security in our community and with our colleagues and friends. What I'm going to do today is basically centre my talk around a number of themes. And the first one really is to discuss what national security really means. These are the words that we often see used, but I think it's worth just spending a little time discussing precisely what it is we want to address. Then I'll move on to a climate change update. And I think you'll be surprised at some of the things that have happened over the last 4 years. And having finished that, we can move on to discuss risks. Risks, of course, lay at the basis of a lot of our conversations when it comes to climate change and the consequences, including what it means for people and our communities. We'll also think about security guarantees. How safe are we? What is the responsibility of governments to make us safe? How far are we allowing governments to go in doing all of that? Some of these issues, of course, have been brought into highlight over the last 3 months, since March, really, when we entered the current pandemic. We'll talk about some action plans, do's and don'ts, if you like, of our future, and finally end up thinking about this in the context of our armed forces and what it might mean for them. And I'll finish by giving you some further reading if you've got some interest in these issues, and maybe you could join with us with a group of people, concerned Australians, if you like, who are moving on these issues in our community, both through publications and through films. Okay, well, it's been quite a long 4 years since we last spoke. I guess the first item on my list of the extraordinary surprises was when Donald Trump became President of the United States. It was not expected by anybody, certainly not by me, certainly not by our national security community here in Australia, and nor by the national security community in the United States of America. And the advent of Trump into the White House has produced its own set of extraordinary surprises as he moves away from what I would call the classic way of running international relations and great power politics into something that approaches how a used car salesman tries to sell you a used car. I'm not a great fan of Donald Trump's presidency. but we will have to wait and see another 3 months, see what happens over the next 4 years. Here at home, Malcolm Turnbull was replaced as Prime Minister by Scott Morrison, and what was a real surprise last year was, of course, when we were taken into an election with expectations being that Bill Shorten might have been the new Prime Minister, and in my judgment, nearly single-handedly, Scott Morrison pulled off an election win. That was an extraordinary achievement, given where they were coming from and the community of concerns that I saw out there. So we're going to wait and see what happens next. On the global stage, Greta Thunberg, that young teenager, autistic teenager from Sweden, has lit up the campaign on climate change for young people. She's made a real effort to travel around the globe and be present at various gatherings. She spearheaded a number of action initiatives for young people in particular. She is not appreciated by those who deny the advent of climate change, but she is transfixed on what needs to be done and continues to work very hard at it. Closer to home, I suppose, we shouldn't forget the advent of Brexit. The United Kingdom leaving Europe, having abandoned all its Commonwealth in the 1970s in favour of joining Europe. Here we are at the latter end of after the noughties, really, going through a separation process, and nobody knows what that really means. I guess we would all have our personal views about the implications, and we will just have to wait and see. But it is here, it is underway, and we can only guess in what it will deliver for us and for others. I've been associated on arguing for measures to deal with climate change since 2008. And I think what I can say is over the last 4 years, we have seen issues of climate change consequences entering the mainstream debate, even in Australia. There are many groups now, I think, that are much more aligned, and indeed today I was reading about some of our large resource and commodity people coming together to say, let's take climate change consequences seriously and let's try to do something about our future. And finally, in thinking about recent and current learning, there's been quite a lot of work going on by researchers trying to refine our prediction sets, looking more deeply at some of the issues of the past and then moving into the future to make predictions. I think one of the most extraordinary outcomes of that for me has been to learn that it is expected, irrespective of how much effort we make to deal with climate change, global surface temperatures will not likely move beyond about 6.5 degrees Celsius. But I wouldn't want you to think that's a very comfortable existence, and as I'll explain, there are serious implications even going beyond 2 degrees Celsius. So that's the broad agenda. 4 years ago, we dealt with this in a much less positive frame, but now we've got the benefit of improved knowledge through the IPCC. Some of us, and we'll talk about these, unexpected impacts that we did not foresee or should have foreseen but didn't do much about. The Great Acceleration. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the Great Acceleration other than to say there is a significant body of evidence now that shows the world was fairly static from the inception of human beings up to about the 1950s, believe it or not. But when you now map, I think, a matrix of 16 by 16 in terms of society measures and also practical economic measures, you can see that since the 1950s, the great acceleration has taken place, and it leads to a very serious question about where are the big tipping points at which climate catastrophe might occur. And recent climate change related events, both in the Northern Hemisphere and in the Southern Hemisphere, particularly in the Antarctic and Arctic polar regions, the serious heating up of ice sheets going beyond most of the predictions is causing a great deal of more concern. Now I just want to talk a little bit about national security. I define national security as making sure that societies can be reasonably secure in going about their business, free from undue security threats and risks, able to transact their desires in a free and open way, and living in a society where the bulk of people are committed to ethical actions and to support each other. It's very comforting to work inside a community, and of course as human beings we like to work inside our own communities in ways that some other life forms do not share. The term national security has been long front and centre of government approaches, particularly after 9/11, into the noughties, and now more recently in Australia as we address issues of cyber security, the threats from China and other threats that we can see, all have this underlying issue of national security, the role of the state in securing all of us, but on the other hand, of course, sometimes impinging our private affairs and creating those kinds of concerns too. And when I think about concepts of national security, I think you can see it at many levels. On the world stage, I see concepts being state-on-state competitions, state-on-state collaborations, alliance systems, the United Nations, the big picture stuff. How do all of these issues affect our national security? A very big question for my future is, what will the encirclement of China in the Indo-Pacific mean for countries like Australia and our nearby friends? I think it's far too early to say, but we can certainly project some scenarios out there. And then moving closer into our region, and in a more practical sense, to think about national security being impinged upon by security affairs in the archipelago, in the Pacific Island states, in the Antarctic, or New Zealand. These are matters that we also need to keep in mind as we think about national security. And then closer to home, on the domestic front. Anyone who witnessed the unfolding of civil unrest in the United States over the last couple of months might want to reflect on what it might mean if that kind of action broke out here in Australia. And let us be quite sanguine. There are issues of concern within our community about particular groupings, about particular behavioural patterns that are not appreciated by the bulk of people, and so on and so forth. So you should think about our national security in that sense too, because if civil unrest breaks out to the extent that it impinges on our feelings for our civil society, then I would say that is not a world I want to be part of. So, thinking about national security dimensions, and a little bit since our last talk, I think the first thing to say is that 4 years ago, when I told you about our efforts in 2015 to keep climate change on the security agenda. We saw in the Defence White Paper of 2016 that it was mentioned specifically in quite a number of paragraphs and drew out large questions about how the consequences of climate change, threat multipliers if you like, could affect stability in our region through the insecurities in food, energy, water, sea level rise and health. There are serious potentials inside our region, and none of that has gone away over the last 4 years. We've also seen a greater use of our armed forces in countering the impacts of climate change related events. Not just in our region, mainly where extreme weather events affect the islands, but also here at home. Who can forget the presence of the ADF in helping people in Malakuta during the recent summer bushfires, or indeed now the ADF out there trying to manage the impact of COVID-19 in Victoria. These are some of the things that are now having an impact on how we use our armed forces, but at the same time I think also giving greater focus for insecurities in our immediate region, bringing our priorities for activity closer to home and away potentially from the Middle East. But I can also foresee a number of potential issues here. As an example, in New South Wales in the recent summer bushfires, there were 74,000 bushfires, volunteers really, committed to fighting those fires. And that is more people than we've got in the whole of the Defence Force serving full time. In a recent ANU Centre of Gravity paper, I have postulated the introduction of a universal service scheme that matches individual expectations for Australia. I call it the Australian Universal Service Scheme with individual expectations, Aussie for short, because I think that in a country that even by 2050 will only have about 40 million people in it, we need to find a more effective way of using the resources of our people rather than relying on the old system, particularly against the current background where volunteers are drying up quite significantly. And finally, of course, in our national security dimensions, we need to be learning from others. That means we need to be keeping our eyes and ears open to what is going on around the globe, in our world, and having an impact on us. As I said in my introductory remarks, we'll be watching very carefully as to what happens at the next presidential election in the United States, because the result of that election is going to have a huge impact on our next futures. Now I want to talk a little bit about climate change. The first thing to say is that climate change is shorthand for climate change consequences. And climate change consequences are a result of global warming. Global warming occurs mainly because the heating brought about by the sun's rays entering the atmosphere, striking the Earth's surface and being reflected back out, is held trapped in the atmosphere, thus creating a warming effect when greenhouse gases are in our atmosphere and on an increasing level. And in the graph on this slide, as you can see, if you look past about 1950, you can see the trending line upwards away from our past record. And this is, of course, what a lot of climate scientists spend their time thinking about and trying to predict the future over. There are other consequences too from global warming. One of them that I separate out from climate change, which I think mainly impacts weather, is the heating of the oceans. Now, the heating of the oceans has been going on also for quite a long time, but mostly since 1950. It's produced a number of consequences. One is that the size of the ocean has risen a little bit and contributed to sea level rise. Another is that it's changing the nature of life in the oceans, and it's also changing the pattern of currents that affect our weather. And another byproduct of all that energy being absorbed by the ocean is acidification, and that has a pretty direct impact on coral reefs, for example. So when I now think about this, I'm thinking, what does it mean in terms of today's world? And my answer to that is, as I say, having worked on these issues since 2008, I think we're on the cusp. The Climate Council once argued that the decade from 2010 to 2020 was the critical decade in which action would need to be taken to limit the surface temperature increases due to global warming. The record shows that we haven't done that much, in spite of all the talk, over that decade. And so when I say we're on the cusp now, what I really mean is that the next few months and years will dictate our future for the very long term. If we sit on our hands, much as we've done over the last decade, then I'm afraid our future looks very bleak indeed. And that leads me then on to what about our future? And I call that the great unknown. I referred earlier in this talk to the issues of the great acceleration. There are experts on the great acceleration, and one was a colleague of mine, Professor Will Steffen from ANU, who wrote a paper that came out a couple of years ago predicting that the tipping points for climate catastrophe may be a lot closer than had been earlier predicted. And when pushed, Professor Steffen said that he thought the earliest we could enter a tipping point like that might be 2024. That's only 4 years away. So if he's right, we do not have a lot of time to do something about our future. The next part of this that I want to talk about are risks as existential threats. I covered this topic in the paper I submitted to the Senate inquiry on climate change and national security a couple of years ago. Now, we've lived with nuclear war and nuclear war threats since the early 1950s. We went through an early period of scaremongering and all sorts of dreadful thinking about what might happen to the world if a nuclear exchange took place. Here we are today, unwinding some of the security measures such as the START treaties of the 1970s and the agreements of the 1980s, which fundamentally enables the nuclear powers to go about their business in creating more, bigger and smarter nuclear weapons. And there's one thing I do know about nuclear weapons, and that is that states that have them are not likely to give them up. But in truth, our future will lie in the hands of a few people. Only a few people will press the buttons that could lead to a nuclear exchange and it might be game, set and match in a few hours, a few days or a few weeks. The truth is, you and I are not going to have any role to play in it, yet we will all likely be victims of it. And that is an existential threat, because it's highly likely that most of humanity will be wiped out, and if any survive, they'll be very few in number. The second of my existential threats is climate change. When we think about global warming and a lack of action to try and limit global warming to 2 degrees C or under, it should not be a surprise to say that we're entering uncharted territory. There are a lot of predictions and scenarios about what it might mean, and my own prediction, and I'm not an expert, but my own prediction is that right now we're headed to a global warming change of up to 4 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial surface temperatures. Now the problem with that is that at 4 degrees Celsius there will be huge changes in weather patterns and likely catastrophes. There will be huge changes in our food insecurities, our water insecurities, the impact of sea level rise, and for the global health system. This is a very largely unknown area, and there is now a significant conversation that is calling climate change an existential threat. But unlike nuclear warfare, this will not be over in hours, days and weeks. This will be over in potentially years and maybe even a couple of decades. But the end result could be the same. That is, it might wipe out most of humanity as we know it, leaving the survivors to make out the best they can. The world as we know it will be very different. And the problem will be that our children and grandchildren will inherit that world if we do not take action to deal with global warming now. So, what are the challenges then for our national security? Well, up until middle of last year, I would have said this was a straight line trend and rather easy to lay out. But it's a fact that since September last year, we've seen the summer of bushfires, and that was followed almost as soon as they were out by entry into the current COVID-19 pandemic. But the issues I want to raise about these challenges are, firstly, in April 2019, when the fire chiefs, Greg Mullins and a whole bunch of fire chiefs from the east coast of New South Wales approached the federal government and basically said to the government, look, we don't like what we see in the summer to come. We don't have sufficient resources to deal with what we expect. We're in the middle of a very extensive drought. The fuel loads have dried out all over the eastern states and we need help. The answer? A big fat nothing. Now, in September the fire started. In October, when I flew up to the northern coast of New South Wales to be with my brother in his last weeks, we had to fly into Coffs Harbour through bushfire smoke. At the same time in September last year, we started to learn to have to wear particulate masks because of the haze from bushfire smoke. sort of led me to think about all that burning off that we used to do, and the fact that nobody ever mentioned the fact that we might need to wear particulate masks. And then in the following months, and especially in January this year, we had a national disaster over the summer of bushfires. The extent of bushfire damage was 21 times anything that we had experienced to date. And as I said earlier on, the sight of one of our new LHDs of Malakuta having to evacuate civilians from a bushfire-prone area left me in no doubt about the fact of climate change consequences. And I have to tell you, during January, there were a number of phone calls that I received from people who were on the south coast of New South Wales, feeling highly threatened as people were moving their loved ones, their parents and grandparents, out of fire zones during shutdowns, road closures, and all of that. And a few of them thought I could turn on a helicopter to get them out of there. Of course, that was fantasy land. All I could do was say, go and talk to the local fire representatives in your area and make your statement about your needs and see if they can help. And after the bushfires, we entered the pandemic. Now the pandemic broke, some would say, as early as April of 2019 in Spain. There's a little more certainty about the novel coronavirus breaking from Wuhan in China later on in the year, beginning in September. But there's no real certainty about any of that. However, from my research, the first recorded unknown case of pneumonia was delivered in Wuhan in early December last year, and that went largely unnoticed in the world, except in a few places. By March, we were well and truly into it. And as I recall, Australia began to take its precautions on about the 14th of March. Since the 14th of March, I've been collecting statistics for a few selected countries, including the United States and Great Britain, as well as our own, to see how well we're going. And have also participated in a lot of webinars, particularly with countries in Europe and the United States and around here as well. A lot of issues come out of the current pandemic, not least of which the consequences economically of the shutdowns, the consequences on people's mental health of being locked up for too long, and of course the loss of people through death in advance of their due time. But it raises for me a very big question. Both these issues in Australia showed a lack of preparedness. We were not prepared for the bushfire season, and we bore the consequences of that, and we still are. There are still a lot of people whose lives have still been badly affected, and they're still waiting for the help that they justly deserve. We were also badly prepared for the onset of the pandemic. Do you know that there has been, on average, about every 6 years, a pandemic striking at the world over the last 30 years? This one jumped out of the box because its characteristics are so different from most of those we've seen to date. But in March, we were told not to wear masks because they were preserving what little stocks we had for our healthcare workers. The run on our supermarkets was enough to tell you that the community became quite concerned about its security at the advent of the pandemic, and it took a little while for the leadership to come together and get organised in working out how to deal with it. And interestingly enough, after the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen the power returning to the states to make decisions about their citizens in terms of closed borders, lockdowns, and health processing. And that's a real shift over the last 20 years. Now here's the big question. The big question for me is, like our current posture in the pandemic, will we listen to science or will we disregard it when it comes to climate change? Will we in Australia do a Trump or a Taiwan when it comes to climate change? It's Taiwan that has, on record, managed the pandemic most successfully. Taiwan has the same population as Australia, and to date they have 470 infections, 7 deaths, and an economy that has not closed. But Taiwan was prepared. In Taiwan, on January 1, when they sprang into action with their command and control centres and their community health setups, they had 40 million masks. In Taiwan, for every person that tests positive for coronavirus, there is a contact tracing team of 5 people. And those people are checked daily and weekly through apps on their phones and by cold calling by the contact tracing teams. We can learn a lot about preparedness from Taiwan, but then Taiwan learned a lot from SARS-2 and MERS and was determined not to repeat its previous experience. Now I just wanted to show you a graphic because this indicates the global effects of Australia's summers of bushfires, put together by NASA, and I think will show you quite a surprising interpretation of what we've been through over the last 12 months. This is now September 2019. Moving into October and the north coast of New South Wales. November brought its own issues, both on the north coast of New South Wales and in the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. And here we are now moving into December. And you can already see the impact of those things the firefighters had warned us about in April of 2019. Now we're moving into January and you can see the south coast of New South Wales and in Victoria is alight. Have a look at this and reflect on it. This is what climate change is doing. These are the kinds of consequences that had been predicted, and yet in September 2019 we were unprepared. So now I want to just briefly go through some do's and don'ts, some of the kinds of issues about a green economic recovery put out in the Climate Action Tracker. A range of things here that we should be doing, and remember, I've already said to you, we need to act urgently now if we're going to try and hold global warming temperatures down to 2 degrees Celsius or move beyond it. And the problem, of course, is that there is quite a lot we need to be doing. We need to be looking at fiscal reform on fossil fuel subsidies and providing direct report for zero emission technology. We need to look at low carbon options for transportation systems, both for industry and for our home use. And at home we need to be getting more efficient, using digital devices, looking at low carbon technologies. The aviation sector is going to need a bailout, I predict, but will not be nearly as significant polluter as it was post the pandemic with travel restrictions. For buildings, there is much that we need to do as well. We need energy efficient retrofits of existing buildings, and we need to construct new low and zero energy buildings. These should become our new planning standards, and we also need to make sure our buildings are protected against extreme weather events. And on land use and the environment, we need to think about landscape restoration and reforestation. Now, this little graph here shows you a set of futures from 2020 onwards. And you can see that if we implement urgently the 1.5 degrees C Paris compatible strategies, we might have some chance by 2030 of reducing the impact of greenhouse gases. Most scientists today would say it's pretty well impossible to get down to 1.5 degrees C now. Most are really talking about heading for a 2 degrees C warming target. That is achievable, but serious action needs to take place in the next couple of years. Further up, you can see the post-COVID-19 current policies. That is, if it's back to normal, as the words that have been put out there, we're going back to normal, then you can see there'd be no change in fossil fuel investments and no particular emphasis put on green investments. And that really means we're off into the unknown future, as I talked to you earlier about, potentially up to 4 degrees Celsius warming. Now this is a little thing I extracted which talks about doing no harm. And it sort of summarises the concerns that we ought to have. First of all, that fossil fuel based industries are going hard at it, trying to get governments to intervene in favour of what they want and not acting in favour of climate change. I highlight that in Australia, federal and state governments seem to be pushing for expansion of coal mines and LNG export facilities, and not really taking into account that the world needs to move away from coal and gas. I do understand how troublesome that is because it requires a new economy, not based on exports of coal and LNG. But surely this is time to be thinking about what the post-COVID new sustainable Australian economy should look like. I'd like to see the plan. I'd like to see where are the targets and the way we're going to achieve that. In March this year, China approved 5 new coal-fired power plants, but they're going to rely on Chinese supplied coal to fuel them, and their coal is very, very dirty compared to Australian coal. And the kicker, of course, is that in the long term, reduced economic growth arising from economic damage caused by not fundamentally changing emissions in the direction needed to meet the Paris Agreement and requiring governments to take affirmative and positive action to ensure stimulus and to put in place a focus on low and zero carbon developments, there is a risk of winding back, resulting in emissions being even higher in 2030 than would otherwise have been the case. I said earlier that I put a submission into the Senate's inquiry into climate change and national security. That report was delivered in April of 2018, and it made these observations: that climate change threatens state and human security, and it pointed out that sea level rise and natural disasters would be the key challenges. I've already pointed out that the heating of the oceans has led to sea level rise, and of course, as I'm sure you all know, the melting of the polar ice is also going to add to sea level rise. There is uncertainty about the extent of sea level rise, but it's not going to be less than 1 metre, and some are predicting a rise of at least 10 metres, and that has very serious consequences for a lot of low-level countries, including our Pacific Island states, our neighbours, in other words. And natural disasters such as tropical revolving storms are key challenges. The storms that I think about are going to be more frequent and more intense. But because of the warming of the ocean, they'll also be spread over a much greater area. And as I said to you in 2016, have our building codes in northern New South Wales been adjusted for the impact of Category 5 intensity cyclones? Because if they haven't, we're going to be in serious trouble. The Senate inquiry also noted that Australia and its backyard were vulnerable. By that it means our Pacific Island states, the Philippines, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and ourselves. A few years ago I was connected to a mission from the European Union who'd come to Australia to talk about climate change because, as they said at the time, Australia leads the world in dealing with the impact of climate change, and we want to learn from what you do here. The Senate also judged that defence needs to plan ahead. That wouldn't be a surprise to anybody with a military background. I think we've always been good at planning ahead, and I think the evidence is that we have been planning ahead. The problem has been, in the past, that defence planning has had to take notice of the fact that government wasn't particularly supportive. I hope that's changed, and I look for more to come. And the Senate inquiry also observed that the issues created by climate change consequence impacts cut across a whole of government perspective. In fact, it's more than the whole of government. It cuts across government at federal and state level. It cuts across government at local government level, and it cuts across issues in our communities. When I look back on the summer of bushfires, and less so in the pandemic, I thought one of the really good outcomes was an appreciation of how communities looked after each other. And you know, looking after each other in our communities does produce resilience. And a resilience community is what we're going to need to deal with climate change consequences in the future. So where are we now? 4 years is a very long time. The population continues to grow. We're still predicting the population will be around 10 billion people by 2050. About a third of those are going to live in our region. I talked earlier about the encirclement of China. China will be about 1.5 billion people. We will be 40 million people. That's not going to be a lot. Our near neighbour Indonesia will be about 313 million people in 2050. And I don't think the deaths from the current pandemic are going to make much difference. But deaths from future pandemics, as I said, about every 6 years might. Our knowledge about climate change has improved considerably. Researchers have been focusing now more onto the detail and more thorough research. So we're getting to know a little more. But still, we have the big imponderable. How much effort will we really make to curb global warming? What about geoengineering solutions? Will they have much impact, or will the side effects produce something worse? We don't know. And there is more recognition now that climate change has a national security dimension, setting aside existential threat. Now I hope and pray we can avoid the existential threat that I spoke about, but I do not think we can avoid the consequences of climate change. And finally, of course, the national security dimensions cannot be solved by our armed forces alone. It involves all of us in Australia, all of us in our region, and all of us on planet Earth. Now, I thought I'd just finish up with the last couple of slides. First of all, by noting what the armed forces cannot do. And the first thing I'd like to point out is they can't act politically, at least not in this country. And I think that's right and proper. But it also means to me that those of us that are now retired and no longer serving can be more active politically, and we can ask the harder questions of our political leadership, and we should. I think it's our obligation to those that followed. Secondly, our armed forces cannot make up for a lack of leadership and preparedness. I pointed out about a lack of preparedness, and I don't think that's a future that we should allow to go unexamined. I think there is much we need to be doing, and I think when I consider the sustainable economy of the future, we should change it fundamentally. There is much to do and much to think about. And finally, I think we should build societal resilience. Therein lies communities looking after each other, and I think it is a building block to a more successful future. Now, this is my last slide. And I leave it up here because I hope some of you will take an interest in the issues that I've tried to raise here. And I point to this organisation, Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration. It's chaired by a former president of the Coal Association. And as you can see, I've selected some publications that will examine the issues that I've canvassed here in much, much more detail and would be food for thought. And I throw down this challenge to us all to read, mark, learn and inwardly digest before we take action to try and secure our future, a future in which climate change is an important component of our national security. I thank you very much for listening to me today, and I wish you good health and a safe future.
Chris Barrie retired in 2002 after 42 years in the Royal Australian Navy, ending in 4 years of service as the Chief of Defence Force. Since then, he has worked on strategic leadership issues as consultant, teacher and mentor at Oxford University, the National Defence University in Washington DC and the Australian National University. At ANU, Chris is chair of the London Foundation and a director in the Tuckwell Foundation. He teaches on campus and at the Australian Command and Staff College and has facilitated introduction courses for the new Australian Public Service entrants into the Department of Defence. He has also coordinated executive education courses for the National Security College on risk. He is chair PTSD Australia New Zealand, which has launched Fearless Outreach to assist all Australians and New Zealanders who have post-traumatic stress or live with people who have it. He became very concerned about climate change matters in 2006, after which he took advocacy action to raise awareness of the potential costs of inaction. In 2015, he was an author of a report for the Climate Council on climate change, security and the ADF. The launch of this report preceded a conference on the topic which he co-chaired with Professor Will Stephan. Chris is also a member of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change.